Are you new to Bloodborne and struggling with the controls or the game mechanics? Are you looking to try the game out soon and you want to have an easier start without spoiling the entire thing for yourself? Well, this just might be the guide for you. I'm going to do my best to provide 10 useful tips that can really help out a beginner player by helping you understand what you should be doing without ruining your ability to explore and discover things on your own. Number 1. Character creation. First of all, take as much time as you want to make your character look cool, beautiful, hideous, hilarious, or just an absolute abomination. Okay, are you done with that? Your starting class in this game, referred to as background, influences more than you might imagine. Thankfully, for about 95% of characters, there are only 2 backgrounds that are really worth picking. Military Veteran gives really great physical damage and health for the early game, and because of the way the stats are distributed, you can basically level it up into almost any build in the game that you want. You essentially cannot go wrong with Military Veteran. The other really good choice is Cruel Fate. If you have any plans to use any elemental weapons, or you want to play around with some of the magic in this game, which is basically flavored as mystical tools and eldritch artifacts, you should pick Cruel Fate. Your firebombs will do a ton of damage to the early game bosses, and later on you'll want 15 or more arcane anyway, so starting with 14 is never a bad thing. If you want to come up with your own build, the most important thing is to look at the minimum stats of the class, not the maximum stats. You can always raise your good stats later, and you're going to do that, but there's no way to lower the stats that you don't plan on using, so you need these to be as low as possible at the start. Typically, you want either Arcane, Bloodtinge, or both to be your minimum stat. If you're already a ways into the game and you picked a bad starting class, don't worry too much. You can level as much as you need to, so it's really not a big deal. And anyway, I usually recommend people don't think too much or worry too much about their build, or to try optimizing until you're making a second character and you have a better idea of what you're doing. These tips are more just guidelines, so if you're watching this video and you still haven't picked your class, these are the 2 best ones, so just keep that in mind. Number 2, which build should you play for your first run? If you're playing the game for the first time, here are 3 builds that might work for you. I'm going to describe them in order from the most easy to understand to the most complicated. You can pick based on that, or just pick whichever one sounds coolest to you. First of all, you can't go wrong with a pure physical build. If you pick the Military Veteran background, level up strength and skill to 25 each, and then later on, when you know which weapons you're going to be using, you can increase skill, strength, or both all the way up to 50 in order to maximize your weapon damage, and it's really that easy. Bloodtinge and Arcane can be a little complicated for players with less experience to build around and also to play with, so you can just ignore those. Your blunderbuss will be all you need for parrying enemies. The second build I'd recommend is a modified version of this build, which I like to call the Nourishing Hunter. With this build, you want to start with Cruel Fate, and make sure you leave Bloodtinge at the minimum. You really can't afford to waste any stat points on this character. Your first goal should be 25 strength, 25 skill, and 18 arcane. With these stats, you can make really good use of all of the elemental weapons, the quality weapons, the weapons with extra flat damage and arcane damage. You can use the Augur of Abretus, it's the best hunter tool in the game. You can use the Beast Roar, which is great for utility. From here, I usually recommend pushing strength to 50, just because the Holy Moonlight Sword is really strong, and most of the elemental weapons, they scale with strength and arcane, rather than skill and arcane. Plus, with 50 strength, you can also use the best strength weapons in the game, like the Hunter Axe. The Nourishing Hunter is really only slightly more complicated to use compared to a pure physical build, but it gives you a lot more versatility and access to some really fun weapons, and once you do have that 25, 25, 18 stat line, you can kind of invest the rest of your stats wherever you feel like you need them. The last build is the most complicated of the 3 that I'm going to recommend, but I really want to stress that new players should not be afraid of running a pure arcane build as their first character. For some reason, there's this really widespread idea that arcane builds aren't good in the early game, and it's just completely false. It's so wrong. If anyone tells you that, I would guess maybe they've never run a pure arcane character, or they didn't really understand what they were doing, because early game arcane builds are perfectly viable and they're actually really strong. Similar to the Nourishing Hunter, you're going to pick Cruel Fate as your starting class, but there's one major difference in how you're going to level up, and this has huge consequences that actually work in your favor. The only stats you really need to level at all are Vigor and Arcane, because ideally all of your damage is going to be coming from the Arcane stat. That way you can also get as much HP as you need from Vigor, so your character is going to be very tanky and they're going to hit very hard. If you keep leveling Arcane past 50, your Hunter tools will deal even more damage. They can deal insane damage. Early on in the game, you can use Fire Bombs and you can use the Flame Sprayer. They destroy pretty much every boss. In fact, in my Hunter Tool Only challenge that I did recently, I found that the Flame Sprayer just continues to be good for the entire game. There's a very small number of bosses that it doesn't work against, and for those bosses you can just use the Augur of Abretus or something else, or you can just use your weapon. So about the weapons, if there's a weapon you want to hold, you can level up your strength or your skill just to have the exact amount needed to use that weapon. But the main thing about the Arcane build, the pure Arcane build, is that around the mid-game or later on, you're going to get gems that will completely convert the damage of your weapon to elemental damage. And when you do this, all of the damage comes from the Arcane stat. You don't get any bonus from strength or skill. That's why you want to leave them as low as possible, only the exact amount that you need to hold the weapon. The actual mechanics are a little bit more complicated than this, but this is all the information you really need in order to get started with a pure Arcane build. And like I said, the Fire Bombs and the Flame Sprayer are extremely powerful early game tools. Not only that, but early in the game, your weapon upgrades, they matter so much more for your damage than your stats. So even though your strength and your skill are going to be low at the start, your melee damage is going to be good enough to deal with enemies. This is why it's not really a problem. You do need to be willing to put a little bit more thought into your character if you want to have a pure Arcane build, because you have to level your stats correctly. So I do understand if you think this is a little bit intimidating and you don't want to try it out. But I just want to dispel this notion that Arcane builds are weak in the early game. It really couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, I'd say they're one of the strongest builds in the early game, because the Fire Bombs and Flame Sprayer deal so much damage, and enemies are weak against fire in the early game. And your +3 weapon and even your +6 weapon is going to deal plenty of damage, even with low strength and low skill. Number 3, which weapon to use? At this point, it's probably no secret that the Saw Spear and the Saw Cleaver are some of the best weapons in the entire game, and you can also get them both very early on. I think the Saw Spear is a bit better, but as long as you grab one of these and keep it with you, your life will be a lot easier. The weapons are similar enough that you definitely don't need both, so just pick your favorite between the two. Both weapons have really strong basic attacks, really strong transformation attacks, and they deal a surprising amount of damage to the early game bosses because they have bonus damage against beasts. The Saw Spear has a better transformed moveset, and it also gets the beast bonus in both forms. This is why I prefer the Saw Spear personally. Now we gotta talk about the Threaded Cane. While this weapon is very cool, I think it has caused a lot of suffering for new Bloodborne players over the years. Now listen, I understand that every weapon in this game is viable to an extent, and there is some subjectivity involved, but I gotta say, the Threaded Cane, it's not a very good weapon, especially in the early game. Weapon base damage and the weight of the weapon matters so much, and the Threaded Cane has neither of those things. If you want to use it, I'm not gonna stop you, but I honestly believe that like 30% of Bloodborne's reputation as a difficult game comes directly from people picking the Threaded Cane and then struggling against enemies because of the low damage, the low weight, and the bad moveset. The whip form is significantly better than the cane, so keep that in mind. If you're determined to be as elegant as possible, make sure you also wear the top hat and a monocle when you create your character. The Hunter Axe is an incredible and underrated weapon, and it's my personal choice for the best weapon in the game, even above the Saw Cleaver and the Saw Spear. It has high base damage, it has heavy weight, it has a strong moveset in the one-handed form, in the two-handed form. It has really quick, really devastating transformation attacks in both directions. There is genuinely not a single bad or a single useless attack in the entire weapon moveset. It's honestly crazy how good and how versatile this weapon is. Oh, and by the way, the Charged R2 is an amazing tool, and it does have a reputation as a spin-to-win weapon, but don't be afraid to just press R2 without charging it all the way, because this weapon has, in my opinion, the best standing R2 in the entire game, and it will really teach you the value of weapon weight. You can keep enemies stun-locked with the right combination of attacks, and not every weapon can do this, especially against as many enemies as the Hunter Axe can really keep locked down. And that's a quality you can really only learn by using the weapon yourself, and then when you switch back to a different weapon, you'll realize what you're missing. The Ludwig Holy Blade is a favorite of new players in Bloodborne, and there's a reason why it's so popular. You can't start with it, but you can get one pretty early on. Now, if you're coming here from Elden Ring or especially Dark Souls, the idea of using a straight sword and using a great sword, that's pretty easy to make sense of. It's one of the most straightforward weapons. The transformation attacks, unfortunately, for the Ludwig Holy Blade are absolutely awful, and you really can't fluidly switch between the straight sword and the great sword like the way you can with the hunter axe and the saw weapons. But a new player usually isn't going to notice that because they haven't really learned how to use the L1 button correctly, which is why new players tend to overrate this weapon a little bit. They typically just use it in either the sword form or the greatsword form, depending on the situation. Now, the straight sword really isn't fantastic, but the greatsword is really powerful and really easy to use. So I'm not exactly saying that this weapon is bad. I actually think it's very good, but it just doesn't have all of the tools that the Hunter Axe has. One more thing too. If you're going for a 50 strength and 50 skill build, the damage on this weapon will be insane. Although really, at the end of the day, damage isn't everything. I always say that I would rather have a weapon with a good moveset and slightly less damage than a weapon with really high damage and a bad moveset. But as long as you pick any two of these recommended weapons, you can probably handle anything that the game throws at you. And honestly, as long as you pick the Saw Spear, Saw Cleaver, or the Hunter Axe, you can just use that one weapon for the entire game, or just pick whatever secondary weapon you want later on, whatever looks cool or seems cool, you can just pick it up and use it. Number 4, early game exploration. I'm not going to tell you where to go or what to do exactly, but I need to make a few things clear. In the early game, you should have a few specific goals. First, you need to explore the areas as much as possible and try to find helpful items. There are a lot of free firebombs laying around in Central Yharnam, and from time to time, you're going to find these things called Bloodstone Shards. These are the most important thing in the early game. They can be used at the workbench inside of the Hunter's Dream to upgrade your weapon, and this is the best and the most efficient way to increase your damage in the early game. A single weapon upgrade is usually worth as much as 4 or 5 levels, and you can get a +1 or +2 weapon before fighting the first boss. Now trust me when I say this, grinding for 8 or 10 levels before fighting the first boss would be a much bigger hassle than just, exploring the area and collecting a few rocks. The other thing you need to do is find shortcuts. Bloodborne is a game that tends to rely more on shortcuts rather than placing bonfires everywhere. You have really big areas and you only have one lamp at the start of the level. But once you find the shortcut, it will make the path to the boss much quicker and much easier. Also, I recommend when you do find a shortcut that you go back to the Hunter's Dream. Don't just keep wandering around carrying a bunch of blood echoes with you. It's much better to spend them now while you have them, rather than losing them and getting nothing for all of your exploration. While you're fighting the enemies in this area, try to learn the controls of the game. And don't be afraid to use the pebble item to draw out enemies one at a time. These rocks are really useful. After a few hours of playing the game, the controls will feel like second nature to you. But at the start, it can be pretty rough, especially if you're getting surrounded by enemies, and especially if this is your first Souls game and you really haven't learned even the basic controls yet. Thinking about it, this philosophy of exploration and weapon upgrades carries through for most of the rest of the game. When you get into the mid-game section, you're going to have the same goal of just finding twin bloodstone shards, and then upgrading your weapon to +5 or +6. And later on in the game, near the end, you're going to be searching for bloodstone chunks to upgrade your weapon from +7 all the way up to +9. Levels are going to get more expensive over time if you keep leveling up, but weapon upgrades will always be very cheap and very effective. If you're afraid of wasting materials, don't really worry too much about it, because later on in the game, you're going to be able to buy twin bloodstone shards, and these can allow you to upgrade as many weapons as you want, all the way up to +6. But you should be careful when choosing weapons to upgrade to +7 or higher, because the bloodstone chunks are a little bit more tedious to farm. Number 5. Buy blood vials. Now. No matter what time you're watching this video, you probably need to go and buy some blood vials. Like, right now. Unless you've already beaten the game and you're sitting at the end with a full stockpile and you're watching a video guide for new players for some unknown reason, Listen, levels in the early game have an extremely low impact on your character. The cost of buying blood vials and other consumables will get more expensive over time. I very often see people giving advice to level up and then spend the leftover echoes on vials. To be honest, I would take this even a step further because this just leads to people still running out of vials and then they complain about having to farm them. Instead, I would recommend that you just buy your vials first, stockpile as many as you need so you won't run out, and then only invest into levels when you really need them. When you understand which stats to invest into and why you're leveling up, it will have a much bigger impact. Vitality is the most important stat in the early game, and the only one that will usually make a noticeable difference early on. Every level you gain in this game boosts your defense, and Vitality increases your HP. So if enemies are dealing too much damage, even one level in Vitality is usually a good investment. By contrast, looking at a single point of strength or skill, it usually gives you like 1 or 2 extra damage. This is a game where you're hitting enemies for over 100 damage per attack, okay? 1 extra attack power is such a waste. It's so pointless, it's so low impact. Having 1 extra point of strength will almost never make your playthrough go smoother. But if you run out of blood vials, it will grind your playthrough to an absolute halt. You will be standing around farming for blood vials that you didn't need to farm, and then you'll be making the 50,000th post on Reddit complaining about blood vial farming when you could have just bought vials instead of wasting them on pointless levels. If you need 18 strength to use a weapon, okay, go ahead, raise your strength to 18. But otherwise, you don't need to worry about increasing your damage stats until much later on, because weapon upgrades are the most important thing, and blood vials are the second most important thing. If enemies are dealing too much damage to you, just level up your vitality by 1 or 2 points, and other than that, save your levels for later on. Number 6. Listen to Gehrman. So now you understand how to explore, you know how to manage your resources, how to upgrade your weapon, and you can probably get through the first few bosses, but sometimes players will get lost at this point. You won't know exactly where to go next after defeating maybe the 3rd boss, and you're not sure who to ask or how to find out. Well, this old guy in the wheelchair, in the workshop, in the Hunter's Dream, he's here for a reason, okay? His dialogue isn't always the most direct or the most clear, but he does tell you, at every stage in the game, where you're supposed to be going next, or what you're supposed to be doing next. Plus, he just overall gives you some generally good advice, if you can make sense of his weird rambling. Number 7. When to stop leveling. Another post I really often see on Reddit is some variation of, am I underleveled, am I overleveled, when should I stop leveling, and so on and so forth. Okay, so listen, the truth is, levels really don't matter that much in this game. Experienced players, they can beat the game at blood level 4 with minimum stats, and if you allow a bad player to use an exploit and reach max level right away, they could still lose to some of the easiest bosses in the game. But still, there is an answer to this question, and it's made up of a few different components. So first of all are your stats. As you're transitioning into the mid-game and the late game, you're going to have plenty of echoes, levels are going to be cheap still, and you should have lots of blood vials stocked up. This is a good time to finally start thinking about levels, especially because a max upgraded weapon has higher base damage, higher scaling, and this means that the points you invest into skill and strength will actually matter now. Stats give diminishing returns after 25, and once they reach 50, you'll see very little increase beyond this point. So typically it's recommended not to level any stat beyond 50, although I think you can make an exception for Vitality. HP is just really important for every character, and Vitality does continue to give pretty decent returns all the way up to 60, and measurable gains up to maybe 70. Pure Arcane builds can benefit from increasing Arcane stat above 50 with their Hunter tools, and they have a lot of points to spare because they only have the one stat to invest into. But to keep things simple, you should just focus on getting Vitality and your main stat to 50. Then, if you have a second damage stat, get that stat to 25. Almost every strength weapon in the game benefits greatly from having 25 skill, and vice versa. And if you're going pure physical, you can really consider 50 strength, 50 skill as a valid investment. For your overall level, there are a few good times to stop leveling if you feel inclined to do so. Level 76 is great for invader builds if you're interested in PvP. It gives you a really good summoning range for all of the most active co-op and invasion spots in the game. There are lower level invader builds that can be completed, but I wouldn't recommend trying to play at a super low level for a new player because of your defense stat and how it will be very low, and it will make completing the game harder for you on your first playthrough. Plus, the really fun thing about level 76 builds is that they actually just barely are capable of being invaded by the low-level Twink Invader builds. This is actually a well-kept secret of my own design, although I wouldn't be surprised if other people have figured it out on their own, but let's try to keep the level 76 Invader build a secret between you and me for now. Level 90 is around where most people will complete the game on their first run, but you don't have to feel obligated to stop here. If you finish a bit earlier, it's not a big deal. And if you keep leveling past 90, it's also not going to change very much in your playthrough. Level 120 is considered the meta level in this game, so if you want to make a complete build, this should be the level you're aiming to stop at. You can easily fit 50 vitality and 50 in your main stat with a level 120 build, with actually plenty of other stats to play around with. The Nourishing Hunter build that I described earlier can easily reach 50 vitality, 50 strength, 25 skill, 18 arcane, and I think it even has a few extra points left over, just to put things into perspective. Additionally, some people like to go to level 125, especially with Bloodtinge builds, because they're very starved for stat points. You can get these few extra points, and you still have good co-op range with all of the level 120 players. Anything past 120 doesn't really have a good benchmark level, but keep in mind, if you're having fun, it's totally valid to just keep leveling as much as you want to. You can even get maximum stats in every stat. It's going to be harder to find people to co-op with and to invade if you're playing online with randoms, but if you're using a password, you can match up with your friends no matter what your level is. With all that being said, the cost for gaining levels increases over time, and eventually they will become prohibitively expensive. This is why, even if you're not aiming to stop at a specific level, like 120, it can still be a good idea to make sure you level up smart early on. Otherwise, when you get into trouble and you find out that your build's not very good, you're going to have to pay for very expensive levels just to fix your optimized stats. Number 8. Don't ignore the Chalice dungeons. This goes back to my point with Gehrman. He's going to tell you early on to seek the Holy Chalice if you're struggling with the game, and I think it's really important to do this. Basically, after you get your first Chalice, you can use any of the gravestones on the hill near the Messenger Bath to create a Chalice dungeon. Now you need materials, but most of them are either found in the main story or just by playing through the previous Chalice. You see, at the end of each dungeon, you get a new chalice that opens the way to the next dungeon, and you probably already collected the materials to open it right away. They really aren't designed to be played all at once. What I recommend doing is exploring the chalice dungeons for a bit early on when you first get access to them. If you reach a boss that you can't defeat, or if one of the floors is too difficult to clear, just go back and play the main story for a little bit instead. Now, if you hit a wall in the main story and you're struggling with a boss there, just go back to the chalices and explore the dungeons for a bit. If you go back and forth like this, it keeps both experiences feeling fresh. The dungeons are a great place to improve your skills as a player, to gain extra consumables, to get blood echoes, to gain levels, and you can even find some of the best unique loot in the game. On that note, number 9 is blood gems. Early on in the game, you're going to get this gem workshop tool, and this allows you to access a new function at the workbench. In addition to upgrading your weapon, you now have the choice to add blood gems into the gem slots. The shapes for the main melee weapons are radial, waning, or triangle, and you need to find gems in the corresponding shape in order to equip them. They can be freely added and removed from weapons, so don't be afraid to experiment with these. Now, early on, you won't have access to any good gems, so you might not get good use out of this feature, and then later on, you might forget that it even exists. I've seen a lot of players who struggled so much with Bloodborne in the late game because their damage was extremely low, but if they had just found or remembered to equip some of the even mid-tier blood gems, their damage would have increased significantly. I'm not going to go into too much detail on blood gem farming or all of the different effects. I think that's a topic that deserves its own video, but I just want to remind you that while you are exploring those chalice dungeons, you're going to pick up plenty of decent gems along the way, and they can represent a surprisingly huge increase to your attack power, so really don't sleep on those. Plus, later on, if you really want to delve into the deepest and the most dangerous chalices, you can get some awesome gems that will absolutely maximize your damage. By the way, if you're able to find a hairpin and give it to the doll, she gives you a white gem, and when you break this gem, you get a gemstone that can be put into any weapon. It grants you regeneration. What I like to do is put this gem into my blunderbuss. The blunderbuss isn't really an item that you're using to deal damage, but you're always holding it in your left hand, so it's a really fun trick to get constant regeneration effects on your character. And lastly, number 10, don't forget about the Bloodborne Wiki. If you have any other questions about specific information in the game, I cannot recommend the Bloodborne Wiki highly enough. It is one of the best wiki pages for any game that I regularly play. The amount of detailed and comprehensive information here, it's incredible. And it's usually organized in a way that's so clean, it's so easy to read, and I've noticed so many people don't even know that this website exists. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about the Fextra Life wiki for Bloodborne. I'm not talking about the fandom wiki for Bloodborne. There's a website, it's just called Bloodborne Wiki, and because search engines have become less and less useful over the years, if you search or Google for Bloodborne Wiki, it probably won't even be the first result. You have to scroll down to find it. Anyway, I'm just going to leave a link to the Bloodborne Wiki in the description for this video so that you can go there if you want to. If you're wondering about anything that's not explained in this guide, you can absolutely find the answers there. Or just feel free to ask me questions in the comments below. Because I love talking about Bloodborne, I will probably respond to every single comment on this video. As a bonus, I want to briefly talk about guns. You probably noticed that I barely talked about Bloodtinge and barely talked about guns during this entire video, and there is a reason for that. Now, I'm going to say this as somebody who loves the Bloodtinge stat. It is likely a component of my favorite builds, my favorite playstyle for the game. I've done multiple gun-only challenge runs, and it's my favorite stat in the game, and I'm so glad that it was included because it makes Bloodborne such a unique game. Unfortunately, Bloodtinge is the most difficult stat for new players to use. It's the hardest stat to understand, the hardest stat to optimize. There's a ton of misinformation and misconceptions floating around in the community. People who don't really understand how guns work are still answering questions, and then people repeat those wrong answers. And overall, I think if you're starting the game and you're trying to run a Bloodtinge build, it's going to be a confusing and difficult experience. All you need to know is just hold the blunderbuss in your left hand. It is the easiest gun to use, it's the best gun for parrying, and you're not going to be using your gun for damage if you don't know what you're doing. For all of these reasons and more, Bloodtinge is really a topic that requires its own later video that I will hopefully make a guide for soon. In the meantime, if you do want to play a Bloodtinge character, just don't use the Evelyn. That thing is an absolute noob trap. It has no valid use case whatsoever, and if you don't believe me, I will gladly explain it more in the next video. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.